My name is Starly, and at 32 years old, I never expected to find myself standing in a hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning, holding divorce papers while my husband was inside fighting for his life. When my mother in law screamed at me to sign them immediately, or she would make sure I never saw a penny from their family fortune, I finally understood the depth of their betrayal. What she did not know was that I had been secretly funding my husband's experimental cancer treatment for 18 months, spending nearly $150,000 of my own money. The shock on her face when the financial coordinator called 3 days later asking about the suspended payments was something I will never forget. Growing up as Starly Chen, I learned early that success meant security. My immigrant parents worked 18-hour days running a small restaurant to give their children opportunities they never had. Education was everything. Marriage to the right person was everything. Financial stability was everything. When I met Marcus during my final year of law school, he seemed like everything my parents had dreamed of for me. Tall, charming, from an established American family with old money and older traditions. His mother, Jenica, made it clear from our first meeting that she expected perfection from any woman who wanted to join their family. His father, Sterling, was quieter, but no less intimidating, with his silent judgments and measuring stares. The Hamilton family lived in a world I had only seen in movies. Their estate sprawled across 40 acres in Connecticut, complete with stables, tennis courts, and a staff of 12. Family dinners were formal affairs with multiple courses and conversations about politics, investments, and social obligations. I felt like an actress playing a role, constantly worried about using the wrong fork or expressing an opinion that would mark me as unsuitable. Marcus's older brother Darius had married his college sweetheart 5 years earlier, and she had produced two children in quick succession, earning Jenica's approval and a place in the family hierarchy. Thias, Marcus's sister, remained unmarried at 34, focused on her art career, which Jenica tolerated but never celebrated. The pressure on Marcus to marry well and continue the family legacy was immense. Our courtship lasted 2 years, during which I was subjected to constant evaluation. Jenica would invite me to charity luncheons where I was paraded before her friends like a prize horse at auction. She critiqued everything from my posture to my pronunciation, always with a smile that never reached her eyes. You must understand, dear, presentation is everything in our circle. People notice these things. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School and secured a position at one of New York's most prestigious corporate law firms. My starting salary was more money than my parents had ever dreamed of, but in the Hamilton world, it was merely adequate. Sterling made subtle comments about the demands of my career and how they might conflict with family obligations. Jenica worried aloud about my ability to balance professional ambitions with the requirements of being a proper wife. The proposal came during Christmas dinner at the estate. Marcus knelt beside the enormous tree in the main parlor while his entire family watched. The ring was a family heirloom, a 5-carat diamond that had belonged to his great-grandmother. I said yes because I loved him, but also because saying no would have felt like rejecting everything my parents had sacrificed to achieve. Our wedding was a production worthy of a royal family. 400 guests, a reception at the country club, and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. The ceremony was beautiful, but I felt disconnected from it, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. During the reception, Jenica pulled me aside for what she called a private chat. Now that you are officially part of this family, there are certain expectations. We have a reputation to maintain, standards to uphold. I trust you understand the importance of your role. The first year of marriage was an adjustment period filled with unspoken rules and subtle corrections. I learned that Hamilton wives did not work late hours that interfered with social obligations. We did not express political opinions that contradicted the family position. We certainly did not question family decisions or financial arrangements. I was expected to be decorative, supportive, and invisible when necessary. Marcus and I moved into a penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side, a wedding gift from his parents that came with monthly maintenance fees higher than most people's rent. The apartment was stunning, but felt like a museum, filled with antiques and artwork chosen by Jenica's decorator. I was not allowed to change anything without family approval. My career began to suffer under the constant pressure to attend family events and social functions. I missed important client meetings for charity galas and turned down challenging cases that would have required travel. My supervising partner noticed the change in my commitment level and mentioned it during my first annual review. I made excuses about personal obligations, but I could see doubt creeping into his evaluation of my potential. The first major crisis came in our second year of marriage when Marcus began experiencing severe fatigue and unexplained weight loss. Initial tests revealed nothing concerning, but the symptoms persisted. Jenica dismissed his complaints as stress from work pressure, suggesting he needed to develop more stamina like his father and grandfather before him. Sterling agreed, recommending that Marcus toughen up and stop acting like an invalid. When Marcus finally collapsed during a business dinner, the emergency room doctors discovered what his family had refused to acknowledge: stage 3 pancreatic cancer, aggressive and already spreading. The diagnosis shattered our carefully constructed world of social events and family expectations. Suddenly, none of the rules seemed to matter except one. Marcus needed treatment, and he needed it immediately. The oncologist outlined a treatment plan that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Insurance would cover basic care, but the most promising experimental therapies were not included. These treatments could extend his life by years or potentially save it entirely. The Hamilton family wealth could easily afford such expenses, but Sterling and Jenica hesitated, consulting with lawyers about the financial implications and insurance limitations. While they debated, I made my own decision. I liquidated my retirement savings, took loans against my law firm partnership track, and mortgaged our future to pay for every treatment that offered hope. Marcus was too sick to understand the financial details, trusting that his family was handling everything. I let him believe that because protecting his peace of mind seemed more important than credit for my sacrifices. The experimental treatment center became my second home as I researched every possible option, interviewed specialists across the country, and coordinated care that gave Marcus the best possible chance of survival. The financial coordinator knew my name and had my credit card information memorized. Each payment was a bet against time, a gamble that love and money could overcome biology and genetics. What I did not anticipate was how my dedication to saving my husband would be interpreted by his family as an attempt to control him and manipulate their family dynamics. The more involved I became in his care, the more suspicious Jenica became of my motives. Why was I pushing for expensive treatments? What did I hope to gain from Marcus's recovery? Her questions revealed a mindset where love was transactional and every gesture had an ulterior motive. This brings us back to that hospital parking lot at 2 in the morning, divorce papers in my hand, and 18 months of medical bills behind us. The moment when everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and love was about to be tested in ways I never imagined possible. The months following Marcus' diagnosis became a blur of hospital corridors, insurance phone calls, and treatment schedules that consumed every aspect of our lives. I transformed from a corporate lawyer into a full-time medical advocate, learning terminology I never wanted to understand and navigating healthcare systems designed to exhaust patients into submission. The experimental treatment center was located in Philadelphia, requiring us to travel 3 times per week for infusions and monitoring. Each round trip cost us 8 hours, plus hotel stays when Marcus was too weak to return home the same day. I negotiated with my law firm for remote work arrangements, taking calls from hospital waiting rooms and reviewing contracts during chemotherapy sessions. The financial burden grew exponentially as we pursued every promising option. The initial experimental protocol cost $35,000 per month, not including supportive medications, imaging studies, and consultations with specialists. When that treatment showed limited effectiveness after 4 months, we switched to a newer combination therapy that cost even more. My credit cards reached their limits within 6 months. I sold my jewelry, including the engagement ring Marcus had given me, telling him I was having it cleaned and reset. I borrowed against my law firm partnership stake, leveraging my future earnings for his present survival. Each financial decision felt simultaneously necessary and reckless, but the alternative was watching him deteriorate without fighting. The Hamilton family remained curiously absent during this period. Sterling would call occasionally to ask about Marcus' condition in the detached tone he might use to inquire about stock prices. Jenica sent care packages filled with homemade soup and inspirational books about positive thinking, as if cancer could be defeated through proper attitude and home remedies. When I suggested that the family contribute to Marcus' medical expenses, Jenica responded with injured surprise. Of course we want to help, but we must be practical about these experimental treatments. The doctors have not guaranteed success, and we cannot pour money into false hope. Besides, insurance should cover necessary care. The distinction between necessary care and experimental treatment became a constant source of tension. Insurance covered basic chemotherapy that offered Marcus a 10% chance of 2 years survival. The experimental protocols we were funding privately offered 40% survival rates and the possibility of complete remission. To me, the choice was obvious. To his family, I was being financially irresponsible and emotionally manipulative. Marcus remained largely unaware of these family dynamics, focused entirely on survival and recovery. The treatments left him exhausted and nauseous, requiring constant care and monitoring. I hired private nurses for overnight shifts, arranged for meal delivery services, and converted our bedroom into a medical facility with oxygen monitors and IV equipment. My own health began to deteriorate from the stress and exhaustion. I lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started having panic attacks in hospital elevators. My law firm colleagues noticed the change, but attributed it to the normal stress of dealing with a spouse's serious illness. Nobody knew the extent of my financial sacrifice or the isolation I felt from Marcus' family. The breakthrough came in month 14 of treatment, when Marcus' latest scans showed significant tumor reduction. The experimental protocol was working, and his oncologist was optimistic about long-term survival prospects. For the first time in over a year, we allowed ourselves to hope for a normal future. This good news, however, triggered an unexpected response from the Hamilton family. Instead of celebration, Jenica expressed concern about the financial implications of Marcus' recovery. What happens to all this medical debt you have accumulated? How will you manage these expenses long term? Her questions suggested that my dedication to saving her son was somehow financially motivated. Sterling took a more direct approach, suggesting that I had overextended our resources and created unnecessary financial obligations. A more conservative approach might have achieved similar results at a fraction of the cost. His criticism stung particularly because it came at the moment when our gamble was paying off. The family dynamic shifted as Marcus' health improved and he became more aware of our financial situation. When he discovered the extent of my borrowing and spending, his reaction surprised me. Instead of gratitude, he expressed embarrassment about our debt and concern about how his family perceived our choices. "Why did you not tell me how much this was costing?" he asked during one of our drives home from treatment. "I would never have agreed to bankrupt our future for experimental medicine." His words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both his prognosis and my motivations. I had not bankrupted our future. I had invested everything to ensure we had one. The tension came to a head during a family dinner at the estate when Marcus was finally well enough to attend social gatherings. Jenica asked pointed questions about our financial recovery plan, suggesting that perhaps it was time to consider more affordable housing and lifestyle adjustments. The implication was clear. My spending on Marcus' treatment had been excessive and irresponsible. I tried to explain that the experimental treatments had literally saved Marcus' life, that without them, he would likely not be sitting at their dinner table. But my words were dismissed as dramatic and self-serving. Jenica suggested that faith and family support might have been equally effective at a fraction of the cost. The conversation revealed deep philosophical differences about the value of money versus life, about family obligations versus individual autonomy, about love expressed through sacrifice versus love expressed through practical support. I realized that the Hamilton family viewed my financial dedication as manipulation rather than devotion. Marcus, caught between his family's criticism and his gratitude for my sacrifices, began to question whether I had acted appropriately. Did I consult him adequately before making major financial decisions? Had I respected his autonomy as a patient and husband? His doubts hurt more than his family's direct attacks. The medical bills continued even during Marcus's recovery period. Follow-up scans, maintenance medications, and ongoing monitoring required monthly payments that strained our already stretched resources. I took on additional legal work, accepting cases I would normally decline and working hours that left me exhausted and resentful. Meanwhile, the Hamilton family resumed their normal social schedule, hosting dinner parties and charity events as if the past 18 months had been a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening crisis. Marcus eagerly returned to these gatherings, grateful to feel normal again, and eager to put the cancer experience behind him. I found myself increasingly isolated at these events, watching Marcus laugh and socialize while I calculated how many billable hours each evening cost us. The financial stress had not disappeared with his improved health. If anything, it had intensified as we tried to rebuild our resources while managing ongoing medical expenses. The breaking point approached as Marcus' health stabilized and the family pressure to return to normal life intensified. Jenica began making subtle comments about my appearance and attitude, suggesting that I had become too serious and focused on negative things. Perhaps it was time to move forward positively rather than dwelling on past difficulties. Her comments revealed a complete misunderstanding of our situation. I was not dwelling on past difficulties. I was managing present financial realities created by 18 months of medical expenses that had saved her son's life. The debt was real, the monthly payments were ongoing, and the sacrifice had been mine to make. As we prepared for what would become the final confrontation, I began to understand that the Hamilton family had never truly accepted me as one of them. My dedication to Marcus during his illness had been viewed with suspicion rather than appreciation. My financial sacrifices had been seen as manipulation rather than love. And my ongoing stress about our economic situation was viewed as inappropriate negativity rather than legitimate concern. The stage was set for a showdown that would reveal the true nature of family loyalty and the price of loving someone whose family viewed affection as conditional on social acceptability and financial propriety. The final confrontation began innocuously enough at Marcus' birthday celebration, 18 months after his initial diagnosis and 6 months into his remarkable recovery. The Hamilton family had planned an elaborate party at their estate, inviting 40 of their closest friends to celebrate what Jenica called a triumph of family strength and positive thinking. I spent the morning of the party reviewing our monthly budget, trying to figure out how to manage the upcoming payment for Marcus' maintenance medication while covering our basic living expenses. The irony was not lost on me that we were celebrating his life at a party that cost more than 2 months of his cancer treatment. The guest list read like a social register of Connecticut's most established families. These were people who measured success in generations rather than years, who viewed new money with suspicion and financial struggle as a character flaw. I felt like an intruder at my own husband's birthday celebration. Marcus had been feeling stronger lately, well enough to return to limited work responsibilities and social obligations. His appetite had returned, his color was better, and his latest scans showed no signs of cancer recurrence. By all medical measures, the experimental treatments had been successful beyond our most optimistic hopes. However, this success had created unexpected complications in our family dynamics. As Marcus' health improved, his memory of the darkest moments seemed to fade. The nights when we thought we might lose him, the desperate searches for experimental treatments, the crushing weight of financial decisions made under impossible pressure. These experiences had bonded us during his illness, but now seemed to distance us during his recovery. The party itself was a masterpiece of Hamilton family presentation. The estate grounds were decorated with lights and flowers, tables were set with crystal and silver, and a string quartet played classical music on the terrace. Guests arrived in expensive cars driven by uniformed chauffeurs, the women adorned with jewelry worth more than most people's houses. I had chosen my outfit carefully, a conservative navy dress that Jenica had once complimented, paired with pearls and low heels. My goal was to blend in, to avoid any criticism that might reflect poorly on Marcus during his celebration. I'd learned that being a Hamilton wife meant being constantly evaluated on presentation and propriety. The first few hours passed smoothly. Guests congratulated Marcus on his recovery and praised the family for their strength during difficult times. Several people mentioned how wonderful it was to see him looking so healthy again, crediting good genes and fighting spirit for his successful treatment outcome. Nobody mentioned the experimental therapies that had actually saved his life. Nobody acknowledged the financial sacrifice that had made his recovery possible. The narrative being constructed was one of natural resilience and family support, edited to remove any uncomfortable details about money or medical debt. I found myself standing alone during the cocktail hour, watching Marcus charm guests with stories of his recovery that somehow omitted the most crucial elements. He spoke of the excellent care he had received, the supportive medical team, and the love of his family, but never mentioned the experimental treatments or their cost. Jenica approached me during this moment of isolation, looking radiant in a silk dress that probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. She carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had never doubted her place in the world or questioned her right to judge others. "You look tired, dear," she said with false concern. "Perhaps you should consider taking some time to focus on self-care now that Marcus is doing so much better. All that stress has taken quite a toll on your appearance." Her criticism was delivered with a smile and witnessed by several other guests, ensuring maximum impact. I managed a polite response about being grateful for Marcus's health, but her words stung precisely because they contained truth. 18 months of medical crisis and financial stress had aged me visibly. I had gray hairs that had not existed before his diagnosis, and lines around my eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. The conversation continued as other women joined our circle, all of them long-time Hamilton family friends who had watched my integration into their social group with varying degrees of skepticism. They spoke about upcoming charity events, vacation plans, and social obligations with the casual entitlement of people who had never worried about money. When someone mentioned an upcoming fundraiser for cancer research, I made the mistake of expressing genuine enthusiasm. This is exactly the kind of research that saved Marcus's life, the experimental treatments that gave him a chance when traditional therapy was not enough. My comment was met with uncomfortable silence. Jenica smoothly redirected the conversation. "Of course, we are grateful for modern medicine, but we must remember that healing comes from many sources. Faith, family support, positive attitude. These things cannot be quantified, but they are equally important." Her words effectively dismissed the role of expensive experimental treatments in favor of intangible family contributions. The pattern continued throughout the evening. Every attempt I made to acknowledge the medical realities of Marcus's recovery was met with gentle correction or outright dismissal. The Hamilton family version of events had no room for financial sacrifice or experimental medicine, only for natural resilience and proper family support. Sturming made a toast during dinner that crystallized this revisionist narrative. He spoke eloquently about his son's courage during adversity and the family's unwavering faith in his recovery. He praised the excellent medical care Marcus had received and the love that had sustained him through difficult times. But the toast carefully avoided any mention of the treatments that actually made recovery possible or the financial cost of that care. Marcus seemed comfortable with this sanitized version of events, perhaps grateful to put the medical details behind him and focus on celebrating his return to normal life. When guests asked him about his treatment experience, he spoke in general terms about fighting spirit and family support, rather than the specific protocols that had saved his life. The disconnect between reality and the family narrative became increasingly painful to witness. I had liquidated my retirement savings and borrowed against our future to pay for treatments that literally prevented Marcus' death. But the evening's conversation suggested that love and positive thinking had been the primary factors in his recovery. During the main course, a family friend asked me directly about our experience with Marcus's illness. Finally, I thought, an opportunity to tell the truth about what we had endured and overcome. I began to speak about the challenge of navigating experimental treatments and the importance of advocating for patients when insurance coverage is inadequate. Jenica interrupted me before I could finish. Oh, Starley tends to focus on the medical details, but we prefer to emphasize the human aspects of healing. Faith, family support, positive spiritual attitude, these things matter more than any particular treatment protocol. Her words effectively dismissed the role of expensive experimental treatments in favor of intangible family contributions. The moment crystallized everything that had been building for 18 months. The Hamilton family had allowed me to sacrifice everything for Marcus's survival, but they would not allow me to acknowledge that sacrifice publicly. My financial dedication was acceptable as long as it remained invisible and unacknowledged. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I sat in stunned silence, finally understanding my position in this family hierarchy. I was useful for my resources and dedication, but not worthy of recognition or respect. My love for Marcus was valued only insofar as it served family interests, without disrupting their preferred narrative. As the evening continued with dessert and dancing, I felt increasingly isolated despite being surrounded by people supposedly celebrating my husband's recovery. The party was beautiful, the guests were charming, and the celebration was everything the Hamilton family excelled at creating. But none of it felt real or honest or connected to the actual experience we had survived. The breaking point was approaching, and I could feel the weight of 18 months of suppressed frustration and unacknowledged sacrifice building toward an inevitable explosion. The question was not whether it would happen, but when and how devastating the consequences would be. The explosion came 3 weeks after the birthday party, during what should have been a routine family dinner at the estate. Marcus had been feeling well enough to resume regular family obligations, and Jenica had specifically requested that we attend to discuss some family business matters that required Marcus' input. I should have suspected something was planned. The formal dining room was set for only 5 people, Marcus and me, his parents, and his sister Thias. Darius and his family were notably absent, which was unusual for a Sunday family gathering. The atmosphere felt orchestrated rather than spontaneous. Sterling opened the conversation during the main course with what seemed like casual interest in our financial recovery. Now that Marcus is doing so much better, we should discuss practical matters. How are you managing the medical expenses, and what plans do you have for getting back on solid financial ground? His question was perfectly reasonable on the surface, But something in his tone suggested this was not merely paternal concern. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to handle the response, but he seemed to be waiting for me to answer. "We are managing," I said carefully. "It will take time to recover from the treatment costs, but Marcus's health is worth any financial sacrifice." I hoped this would satisfy their curiosity and end the discussion, but Sterling pressed further. "Yes, but specifically, what kind of debt are we talking about? What monthly obligations have you created?" The clinical nature of his questions felt like a financial audit rather than family concern. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside me. I had shared some of the financial details with him during his recovery, but not the complete picture. I had not wanted to burden him with the full scope of my borrowing while he was still healing. Now I realized this partial knowledge was creating problems. "The treatments cost approximately $150,000 over 18 months, I admitted. Some of that was covered by insurance, but the experimental protocols were all out-of-pocket expenses." The room fell silent, except for the soft clink of silverware on china. Jenica spoke first, her voice carefully controlled. $150,000? That is more than most people make in 3 years. And you made these decisions without consulting the family? Her question revealed the crux of their concern. Not the amount of money, but my authority to spend it. "I consulted with Marcus," I said, though we all knew his condition during the worst months had made meaningful consultation impossible. The decisions had to be made quickly, often within days of learning about new treatment options. Sterling leaned forward, his business persona replacing his paternal facade. "Starley, you must understand our position. This level of expenditure affects family resources and planning. We should have been involved in these decisions from the beginning." "Family resources?" I repeated, confusion evident in my voice. This was paid from my personal savings and loans against my law firm partnership. I did not ask the family for money. I used my own resources to save your son's life. The distinction seemed to surprise them. Jenica glanced at Sterling before responding. "Well, yes, but married couples' finances are interconnected. What affects Marcus affects all of us. And frankly, some of these experimental treatments seem excessive in retrospect." Excessive. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Treatments that had saved Marcus's life were being characterized as wasteful spending. I felt my composure beginning to crack after 18 months of financial stress and family criticism. Marcus finally spoke, but not in my defense. "Maybe we should have been more conservative in our approach. Some of those later treatments might not have been necessary." His words felt like a betrayal, erasing months of desperate hope and careful research that had given him a future. "Not necessary?" I stared at my husband in disbelief. "Your cancer had spread to your lymph nodes. Traditional chemotherapy was not working. Without those experimental protocols, you would not be sitting here questioning their necessity." The conversation devolved from there. Jenica expressed concern for my emotional state and suggested that the stress of Marcus's illness had affected my judgment. Sterling questioned whether I had researched less expensive alternatives. Thias remained silent, but her expression suggested sympathy for her family's position rather than mine. Marcus attempted to mediate, acknowledging that I had acted out of love while also validating his family's concern about financial responsibility. His diplomatic approach satisfied no one and left me feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by people who were supposed to be my family. The final straw came when Jenica suggested that perhaps it was time for me to consider therapy to process the trauma of Marcus's illness and learn healthier ways of managing stress and decision-making. Her recommendation was delivered with the same tone she might use to suggest a new hairdresser, but the implication was devastating. According to the Hamilton family narrative, I was the one who needed professional help, Not them for their absence during Marcus's illness, not him for his passive acceptance of their criticism, but me for my excessive dedication to keeping him alive. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity. I excused myself from dinner, claiming a sudden headache, and went to wait in our car. As I sat in the estate's circular driveway, I realized that 18 months of financial sacrifice had purchased Marcus's life, but cost me my place in his family, and possibly my marriage. When Marcus finally emerged from the house an hour later, his expression was troubled but not apologetic. "They're just concerned about our future," he said, as he settled into the passenger seat. "Maybe they have a point about being more financially cautious going forward." His words confirmed my worst fears. The experimental treatments had saved his life, but his recovery had allowed him to forget how desperate our situation had been. Distance from death had created distance from gratitude, and his family had successfully reframed my sacrifice as excessive spending rather than life-saving dedication. The drive home passed in tense silence, both of us processing the evening's revelations in our own ways. I was realizing that love and sacrifice were not enough to earn respect or acceptance in the Hamilton family hierarchy. Marcus was perhaps beginning to understand that his recovery had created new problems in our relationship dynamics. When we arrived at our apartment, I made a decision that had been building for months. I gathered all the medical bills, treatment receipts, and financial documents related to Marcus's care and spread them across our dining room table. Every experimental protocol, every specialist consultation, and every supportive medication that had contributed to his survival was documented in painful detail. "Marcus," I said quietly, "I want you to look at these documents and understand exactly what happened during your illness. Not the sanitized version your family prefers, but the actual medical and financial reality of keeping you alive." He sat at the table reluctantly, examining papers he had been too sick to review during treatment. The progression was clear: traditional treatments failing, experimental options emerging, costs escalating, and outcomes improving. The documentation told a story of systematic medical intervention that contradicted his family's narrative of natural recovery. As he read through the papers, I watched his expression change from reluctant curiosity to genuine surprise to something approaching recognition. The experimental protocols had not been excessive luxuries, but essential interventions that had literally saved his life when conventional medicine had failed. "This changes things," he said finally, though I wasn't sure whether he meant our financial situation, his relationship with his family, or his understanding of my sacrifices. Perhaps all three, but his acknowledgement felt too little and too late. The damage to our relationship had been done through months of family pressure and gradual erosion of trust. Even Marcus's newfound appreciation for my dedication could not undo the isolation and criticism I had endured while fighting for his survival. The next phase of our story would reveal whether love could overcome family politics and whether gratitude could repair relationships damaged by months of misunderstanding and manipulation. The weeks following our dining room revelation were marked by an uncomfortable truce. Marcus seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of my financial sacrifice and the medical necessity of the treatments his family had dismissed. However, his newfound appreciation existed alongside continued pressure from the Hamilton clan to view my actions as excessive and emotionally driven. I returned to work with renewed focus, taking on high-profile cases that would help rebuild our financial foundation. The law firm had been patient during Marcus's illness, but my reduced availability had cost me opportunities for advancement. Now I worked late into the evenings, motivated by both professional ambition and financial necessity. Marcus's recovery continued steadily. His quarterly scans remained clear, his energy levels improved, and his oncologist expressed optimism about long-term survival. The experimental treatments that had seemed like desperate gambles 18 months earlier were now proven successes, validating every financial decision I had made. Yet, this medical triumph created new challenges in our relationship. As Marcus's health normalized, he wanted to return to the social life and family obligations that had defined his pre-cancer existence. I found myself reluctant to resume the elaborate dinner parties and charity events that had once been central to our marriage. The Hamilton family gatherings became exercises in emotional endurance. Jenica continued her subtle criticisms of my priorities and attitudes, suggesting that I had become too serious and financially focused. Sterling made comments about the importance of moving forward positively rather than dwelling on medical expenses and past difficulties. Their ability to rewrite history was remarkable. The 18 months when they had been largely absent during Marcus's crisis were recast as supportive presence. My desperate efforts to find life-saving treatments became excessive medical intervention. The financial sacrifice that had preserved his son's life was characterized as poor judgment and emotional overspending. Marcus found himself caught between his family's perspective and his growing understanding of reality. When alone with me, he expressed gratitude for my dedication and acknowledged the necessity of the expensive treatments. But in family settings, he reverted to diplomatic language that avoided confronting their revisionist narrative. The situation reached a new level of complexity when Sterling suggested that we consider moving to a more affordable apartment to better manage our medical debt. His recommendation was presented as helpful financial advice, but the implication was clear. My spending on Marcus's treatments had created problems that required lifestyle adjustments. I had already made every possible financial sacrifice short of bankruptcy. My retirement savings were depleted, my credit cards were maxed out, and I was working 60-hour weeks to service loans I had taken against my law firm partnership. The idea that I needed to downsize our living situation after saving Marcus's life felt like punishment for my dedication. The breaking point approached during a family dinner in early December when Jenica announced that she had been researching our medical expenses and had concerns about some of the treatments I had chosen. She had consulted with a friend whose husband was an oncologist, and he had suggested that several of the experimental protocols might not have been necessary. Her amateur medical evaluation of life-saving treatments was breathtaking in its audacity. She was essentially arguing that I had wasted money on therapies that had successfully cured her son's cancer. The logic was so twisted that I initially could not formulate a response. Marcus attempted to defend the treatment decisions, but his explanation was half-hearted and undermined by his family certainty. They had constructed a narrative where love and family support were the primary factors in his recovery, with expensive medical intervention playing a secondary and possibly unnecessary role. The conversation revealed fundamental differences in how we valued life versus money. To me, any cost was justified if it increased Marcus's chances of survival. To his family, there were acceptable limits on medical spending beyond which treatment became financially irresponsible, regardless of outcome. These philosophical differences might have remained abstract, if not for their practical implications. Sterling began making comments about our financial management and suggesting that we needed professional help to address the debt I had accumulated. He recommended a financial advisor who specialized in medical bankruptcy cases. Medical bankruptcy. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. According to Sterling's research, many families faced similar situations after extended cancer treatment, and there were established procedures for managing overwhelming medical debt. His suggestion felt like preparation for financial failure rather than support for recovery. Marcus's reaction to his father's recommendation was telling. Instead of defending our financial decisions or acknowledging my sacrifice, he seemed relieved that there might be an easy solution to our debt problem. The possibility of bankruptcy appeared more appealing than continuing to work toward financial recovery through increased earnings and careful budgeting. I realized that Marcus was beginning to view our medical debt as a problem to be solved rather than an investment in his survival to be repaid. The shift in perspective was subtle but significant, changing him from a grateful beneficiary of my sacrifice to a victim of financial circumstances beyond his control. The final insult came when Jenica suggested that I should consider taking a leave of absence from work to focus on managing our financial recovery and supporting Marcus's emotional healing. Her recommendation would have eliminated our primary source of income while increasing our dependence on family assistance, effectively placing me under their financial control. The manipulation was sophisticated and systematic. By reframing my life-saving efforts as financial irresponsibility, they were positioning themselves as the reasonable parties, offering practical solutions to problems I had created. Meanwhile, Marcus's growing acceptance of their narrative was eroding the foundation of our relationship. On a cold Thursday evening in mid-December, exactly 2 years after Marcus's initial diagnosis, I made a decision that had been building for months. I would not continue to apologize for saving my husband's life, and I would not accept financial control as the price of family acceptance. The confrontation that followed would test every relationship I valued and force everyone involved to choose between comfortable lies and difficult truths. The stakes could not have been higher. Not just my marriage and financial future, but my sense of self-worth and the validation of 18 months of dedicated sacrifice. As I prepared for what I knew would be a defining moment, I gathered the medical records and financial documents that told the true story of Marcus's survival. The numbers were stark and undeniable, creating a narrative that could not be revised or reinterpreted to suit family preferences. The time for diplomatic silence and polite acceptance had ended. Truth had a cost, but continuing to live with lies and manipulation had proven even more expensive. The confrontation I had been avoiding came at the worst possible time and in the worst possible place. Marcus had been readmitted to the hospital for what should have been a routine follow-up procedure, but complications during surgery had left him in intensive care, fighting for his life once again. I spent 72 hours in the hospital waiting room, surviving on coffee and vending machine food, while Marcus remained unconscious following emergency surgery to address internal bleeding. The experimental treatments that had cured his cancer had left his system compromised, making routine procedures more dangerous than they would be for healthy patients. Sterling and Jenica arrived on the second day, their presence adding tension to an already stressful situation. They brought flowers and concerned expressions, but their first questions were about insurance coverage and hospital costs, rather than Marcus' condition. Their priorities revealed everything about their mindset and values. While we waited for news from the surgical team, Jenica pulled out a manila folder that she had apparently been carrying in her purse. She handed it to me with an expression that mixed sympathy with determination, explaining that she had been researching our options for financial recovery and legal protection. The folder contained divorce papers. Not just any divorce papers, but documents that had been prepared by the Hamilton family attorney and specifically designed to protect family assets from medical debt. According to Jenica's explanation, divorcing Marcus while he was hospitalized would legally separate my medical spending decisions from Hamilton family resources and protect everyone from future financial liability. The papers had been prepared weeks earlier, suggesting that this conversation had been planned regardless of Marcus's current medical crisis. His hospitalization simply provided an opportunity to present divorce as a practical solution to financial problems, rather than family rejection of my dedication and sacrifice. I stared at the documents in disbelief, trying to process the audacity of presenting divorce papers while my husband fought for his life in intensive care. The timing was calculated for maximum emotional impact and minimum resistance. I was exhausted, worried, and isolated in a hospital environment where family support should have been paramount. Jenica explained the arrangement with the matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss catering options for a dinner party. The divorce would be temporary and financial in nature, allowing Marcus to recover without the burden of medical debt I had accumulated. Once his health was stable and our financial situation improved, we could remarry if we chose to do so. Her suggestion that the divorce could be reversed revealed complete misunderstanding of both legal marriage and emotional commitment. Divorce was not a financial planning tool that could be deployed strategically and withdrawn when convenient. The legal dissolution of our marriage would have permanent consequences regardless of future reconciliation possibilities. Sterling supported his wife's recommendation with practical arguments about asset protection and financial planning. He had consulted with attorneys and accountants who confirmed that divorce would shield family resources from medical debt collection efforts. The Hamilton estate and business holdings would be protected from any claims related to Marcus's treatment expenses. The subtext was clear. My financial sacrifice during Marcus's illness was now viewed as a liability that threatened family wealth. Rather than acknowledging gratitude for my dedication, they were treating my medical spending as reckless behavior that required legal protection. I asked to speak with Marcus before making any decisions, but Jenica explained that he was still heavily sedated and unable to participate in complex discussions. She suggested that signing the papers immediately would protect everyone involved and could always be reconsidered when he was more alert. The pressure to sign immediately was intense and clearly calculated. In the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the medical crisis that had consumed 2 years of our lives, I was supposed to dissolve my marriage to protect his family from the financial consequences of keeping him alive. I refused to sign anything without Marcus's explicit consent and involvement. This reasonable position was met with disappointment and subtle accusations of selfishness. According to Jenica, my reluctance to sign the divorce papers proved that I was more concerned with my own emotional needs than with practical solutions that would benefit everyone. The manipulation was breathtaking in its sophistication. They had transformed my dedication during Marcus's illness into evidence of poor judgment, my financial sacrifice into proof of fiscal irresponsibility, and my love for their son into selfish attachment that threatened family stability. When I continued to refuse signing the papers, Sterling delivered what felt like an ultimatum. If I truly cared about Marcus' well-being, I would prioritize his financial recovery over my emotional attachment to married status. My refusal to consider divorce suggested that my motivations might not be as pure as I claimed. The conversation was interrupted by a nurse who came to update us on Marcus's condition. The surgery had been successful, his vital signs were stabilizing, and he was expected to make a full recovery within a few days. The relief I felt was immediately overshadowed by the realization that his improved condition would intensify family pressure for immediate decisions about our marriage. As we returned to the waiting room, Jenica made one final attempt to persuade me to sign the divorce papers. She painted a picture of financial fresh start and family harmony that could be achieved through temporary sacrifice of legal marriage status. The benefits were presented as mutual and the process as reversible, making my resistance seem stubborn and unreasonable. What she did not say, but what became increasingly clear, was that this divorce would mark the end of my inclusion in Hamilton family decisions and social circles. Once legally separated from Marcus, I would have no standing to influence his medical care, no claim on family resources, and no protection from being excluded entirely from his life. The divorce papers were not just financial planning documents. They were instruments of permanent exile disguised as temporary convenience. Signing them would solve the Hamilton family's problem of my inconvenient presence and financial influence, while leaving me isolated and legally powerless. I told them I would need time to consider their proposal and consult with my own attorney before making any decisions. This reasonable request was met with disappointment and suggestions that delay would only complicate an already difficult situation. Sterling reminded me that Marcus's medical condition remained fragile and that additional financial stress could impact his recovery. The implication was that my hesitation about divorce was somehow threatening his health, adding another layer of emotional manipulation to their pressure campaign. As visiting hours ended and we prepared to leave the hospital, I realized that the next 24 hours would determine not just the future of my marriage, but the direction of my entire life. The Hamilton family had shown their true priorities and their willingness to sacrifice my well-being for their financial security. The choice before me was stark: sign the divorce papers and accept exile from Marcus's life, or refuse and face escalated pressure and manipulation that could destroy us both. Either path led through emotional devastation, but only one preserved my dignity and self-respect. The decision would require courage I was not sure I possessed, and strength I wasn't certain I could find. But 18 months of fighting for Marcus's life had taught me something important about my own resilience and determination. I spent that night in my car in the hospital parking garage, unable to face returning to our apartment while Marcus remained in intensive care. The divorce papers lay on the passenger seat beside me, their presence a constant reminder of how quickly love could be transformed into legal strategy by people who measured relationships in terms of financial liability. The fluorescent lights at the parking garage created harsh shadows that seemed to match my emotional state. Every few hours, I would walk back into the hospital to check on Marcus' condition, hoping he would be alert enough for a real conversation about the impossible choice his family was demanding. By dawn, Marcus was conscious, but still heavily medicated. His speech was slurred and his thinking was clearly affected by pain medication, making meaningful discussion about divorce papers impossible. Yet his family seemed to view his improved consciousness as permission to proceed with their plan. Jenica arrived early with fresh flowers and a renewed sense of urgency about the divorce documents. She had spoken with their family attorney overnight and learned that delaying the filing could complicate asset protection efforts. Time was critical, and Marcus's condition was stable enough to proceed with necessary legal steps. Her impatience revealed the calculated nature of their timing. The medical crisis had been exploited as an opportunity to push through divorce proceedings while Marcus was too weak to fully understand or resist the decision. The family's willingness to exploit his medical vulnerability for legal advantage revealed depths of manipulation I had not fully comprehended. I requested a private meeting with their family attorney to understand the legal implications of the divorce documents. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the law firm, where I learned that the papers were far more comprehensive than Jenica had suggested during her hospital presentation. The divorce agreement would not only dissolve our marriage, but also establish that all medical debt incurred during Marcus's treatment was my sole responsibility. Despite the fact that the expenses had been undertaken to save his life, I would bear complete financial liability for decisions made jointly during his illness. Furthermore, the agreement included clauses that would prevent me from making any future medical decisions on Marcus's behalf and would transfer all authority to his parents in case of medical emergency. I would be legally excluded from his health care entirely, despite having managed his treatment for 18 months. The attorney explained these provisions as necessary protections for the Hamilton family, but their effect would be to erase my role in Marcus's survival while saddling me with permanent financial consequences. The divorce was designed not just to end our marriage, but to rewrite the history of his illness. When I pointed out that joint medical decisions should result in shared financial responsibility, the attorney suggested that my independent decision-making during Marcus's most critical periods established sole liability. The desperate choices I had made to save his life were being used as evidence of unilateral financial responsibility. I left the law firm with a clearer understanding of what the Hamilton family was really proposing. This was not temporary financial planning or mutual protection. It was complete exile, disguised as practical necessity. The divorce would solve their problem of my inconvenient presence while leaving me isolated and financially devastated. Returning to the hospital, I found Marcus more alert and able to engage in limited conversation. When I mentioned his family's divorce proposal, his reaction was not the shock or outrage I had expected. Instead, he seemed resigned to the idea and concerned primarily about the impact on his recovery process. "Maybe it makes sense, temporarily," he said, his voice still weak from surgery, "until we get the financial situation under control and my health stabilized. It does not have to be permanent." His willingness to consider dissolving our marriage as a practical matter revealed how thoroughly his family had influenced his thinking. I tried to explain that the divorce papers contained provisions that would make reconciliation nearly impossible and would assign all medical debt to me personally. But Marcus was still recovering from surgery and found complex legal discussions exhausting. His family had chosen their timing perfectly. Over the next 2 days, as Marcus's condition continued to improve, the pressure to sign the divorce papers intensified. Sterling made daily visits to discuss the urgency of financial planning and asset protection. Jenica brought updates from their attorney about filing deadlines and procedural requirements. The emotional manipulation reached new heights when they suggested that my hesitation about divorce was creating stress that could impact Marcus's recovery. According to their logic, my selfish attachment to married status was potentially threatening his health and demonstrating that I cared more about my own needs than his well-being. The breaking point came on Thursday evening when Marcus was scheduled to be discharged from the hospital. As I prepared to take him home, Jenica pulled me aside for what she called a final conversation about our situation. She had brought the divorce papers with her and had arranged for a notary to be available in the hospital conference room. All that was needed was my signature, and the legal process could begin immediately. The timing was presented as convenient rather than coercive, but the pressure was unmistakable. Standing in that sterile conference room with the notary waiting and Marcus being prepared for discharge, I faced the moment that would define the rest of my life. The choice was not just about signing papers, but about accepting or rejecting the Hamilton family's narrative of my role in Marcus's survival. If I signed, I would validate their claim that my medical spending had been excessive and irresponsible. I would accept sole financial responsibility for saving Marcus's life while giving up any future authority over his care. I would become an expensive mistake that needed to be legally contained rather than a loving wife who had made desperate choices to preserve her husband's life. If I refused to sign, I would face escalated manipulation and pressure that could destroy what remained of our relationship with Marcus. His family would likely increase their efforts to isolate me and could make his recovery process a battlefield of competing loyalties and conflicting advice. Neither choice offered a path to the life I had envisioned when I married Marcus, but only one preserved my dignity and self-respect. Standing in that conference room, surrounded by people who viewed my love as a liability and my sacrifice as a problem to be solved, I made the decision that would change everything. I looked at the notary, then at Jenica, then at the divorce papers that would legally validate 18 months of Hamilton family criticism and manipulation. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but continuing to accept their narrative felt like slowly drowning in someone else's version of reality. The words that came out of my mouth surprised everyone in the room, including myself, but they represented the first completely honest thing I had said to the Hamilton family in 2 years of trying to earn their acceptance and respect.
No. The word hung in the sterile conference room air like a declaration of war. The notary looked confused, Jenica's face went rigid with shock, and Sterling's businessman facade cracked to reveal genuine anger beneath. I had disrupted their carefully orchestrated plan with a single syllable. "I will not sign these papers," I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. "I will not accept sole responsibility for medical expenses that saved your son's life. I will not be divorced from my husband while he recovers from surgery that was necessitated by treatments that kept him alive. And I will not validate your narrative that my love for Marcus was somehow excessive or inappropriate." Jenica recovered first, her voice taking on the patronizing tone I had endured for 2 years. "Starlee, you are not thinking clearly. The stress of Marcus's illness has affected your judgment. These papers protect everyone, including you. Fighting this decision will only create more problems for all of us."
Her response perfectly encapsulated the Hamilton family approach to conflict, dismissed my position as emotional instability, and framed their demands as reasonable solutions. But 18 months of fighting for Marcus's life had given me strength I had not known I possessed. "My judgment saved your son's life," I said quietly. When traditional chemotherapy failed and his oncologist suggested hospice care, my judgment led us to experimental treatments that gave him a 40% chance of survival instead of certain death. When insurance refused coverage and you questioned the expense, my judgment led me to liquidate my retirement savings rather than watch him die. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of hospital activity. Sterling shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps beginning to understand that this conversation would not proceed according to their script. I opened my briefcase and removed the medical records I had brought with me, documentation that told the true story of Marcus's survival in clinical detail that could not be disputed or reinterpreted. Would you like to review his treatment timeline? The cancer had spread to his lymph nodes by month 3. Standard protocol gave him 6 months to live. The experimental treatments I arranged extended that prognosis to potential cure instead of certain death. Jenica tried to interrupt, but I continued. The first experimental protocol cost $35,000 over 4 months and achieved partial remission. The second protocol cost $42,000 over 6 months and eliminated all detectable cancer. The maintenance therapy cost $18,000 over 8 months and has kept him disease-free for the past year. I placed each treatment summary on the conference table as I spoke, creating a paper trail of life-saving interventions that contradicted their narrative of excessive medical spending. Each decision was made in consultation with oncologists at 3 different cancer centers. Each expense was necessary to preserve his life. Each payment came from my personal resources because time did not allow for family financial discussions. Sterling finally found his voice. "Nobody is questioning your dedication, but the amounts involved required better planning and family consultation. These kinds of expenditures affect everyone, not just the immediate patient." His response revealed the fundamental disconnect between their worldview and mine. To them, Marcus's illness had been a family crisis requiring collective decision-making about acceptable financial exposure. To me, it had been a race against time where every delay could mean the difference between life and death. "There was no time for family consultation," I replied. When his oncologist called on a Friday afternoon to say that a clinical trial had an opening but required immediate payment and enrollment, I had 48 hours to decide. When a specialist in Philadelphia offered a new protocol that required starting treatment within the week, I arranged financing over a weekend. I pulled out my phone and showed them the call log from Marcus's most critical period. I spoke with 17 different specialists, researched 23 clinical trials, and coordinated care across 4 different medical centers. While I was doing that, where was the family consultation you think should have happened? Jenica's composure cracked slightly. "We were supporting Marcus emotionally and spiritually. Not everything can be reduced to medical procedures and financial expenditures. Family love and faith matter too." Family love pays for experimental treatments when insurance fails. Faith arranges for second opinions when the first doctor suggests giving up. Emotional support writes checks for $45,000 clinical trials that offer hope when everything else has been exhausted. The confrontation had moved beyond the divorce papers to fundamental questions about love, sacrifice, and family responsibility. The Hamilton family had rewritten Marcus's illness as a story of collective strength and natural resilience, but the medical records told a different truth about experimental interventions and financial desperation. Sterling made one final attempt to regain control of the conversation.
Regardless of past decisions, we need to address present realities. The medical debt exists, and it needs to be managed responsibly. The divorce provides legal protection for everyone involved. The divorce provides legal protection for you. It assigns all financial responsibility to me while transferring medical decision-making authority to you. It solves your problem of my inconvenient presence while leaving me isolated and liable for expenses incurred saving your son's life. I stood up and gathered my medical records, preparing to leave the conference room. I spent $150,000 over 18 months to save Marcus's life. Those treatments gave him a future that would not have existed otherwise. I will not apologize for that dedication, and I will not accept financial punishment for loving your son enough to bankrupt myself preserving his life. The notary packed up her materials, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama that had disrupted what should have been a routine document signing. As she left, the room felt smaller and more charged with tension. Jenica made one last appeal. Think about Marcus. Starlee, this conflict is not good for his recovery. He needs peace and stability, not legal battles and family discord. Her response perfectly encapsulated the Hamilton family approach to conflict. Dismiss my position as emotional instability and frame their demands as reasonable solutions. But 18 months of fighting for Marcus's life had given me strength I had not known I possessed. My judgment saved your son's life, I said quietly. When traditional chemotherapy failed and his oncologist suggested hospice care, my judgment led us to experimental treatments that gave him a 40% chance of survival instead of certain death. When insurance refused coverage and you questioned the expense, my judgment led me to liquidate my retirement savings rather than watch him die. The woman next to the door sat back in her chair now, her curiosity fading into a recognition that her casual interest in my story would be interrupted by a late afternoon consult. While I questioned whether to reset the countdown on my Marcus watch, I read that the next part of her story was about her client who needed her to make sure their wife was done.
Marcus was sitting up in his hospital bed when I returned to his room, looking more alert than he had since the surgery 3 days earlier. The improvement in his condition was remarkable, but I knew that his increased awareness would make the coming conversation more difficult rather than easier. "How did the meeting go?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the outcome. The Hamilton family's carefully planned legal strategy had clearly been discussed with him before I arrived, preparing him for my expected compliance with their divorce proposal. "I did not sign the papers," I said simply, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair that had become my second home. "And I want to explain why before your family has a chance to interpret my decision for you." Marcus' expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Starlee, maybe we should wait until I'm feeling stronger before getting into complicated discussions. The doctors want to keep stress levels minimal during recovery." His response revealed how thoroughly his family had influenced his thinking even during his medical crisis. The idea that honest conversation about our marriage constituted dangerous stress, while their pressure for immediate divorce was somehow protective, showed the depth of their manipulation. "Marcus," I said gently, "do you remember the night in February when your oncologist called to say the standard chemotherapy was not working, when he suggested we consider hospice care and pain management instead of continued treatment?" He nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious as I brought up memories from the darkest period of his illness. "Do you remember what happened next? How we spent that weekend researching clinical trials and experimental treatments? How we found the protocol in Philadelphia that offered new hope when everything else had failed?" "Yes," he said quietly. "You found Dr. Richardson and the experimental combination therapy, but the insurance would not cover it because it was still in trials. And do you remember what I told you that Monday morning when we had to decide whether to proceed with the experimental treatment or accept the hospice recommendation? Marcus closed his eyes, perhaps trying to access memories that had been blurred by pain medication and the trauma of facing death. You said we would find a way to pay for it. That money was not as important as giving me every possible chance to survive. I liquidated my retirement accounts that week. $43,000 that was supposed to fund my golden years. Because $43,000 seemed like nothing compared to the possibility of your survival. The medical records I had brought to the conference room were still in my briefcase. I pulled out the timeline I had prepared and handed it to Marcus, showing him the progression of treatments, costs, and outcomes that had marked his path from terminal diagnosis to complete remission. Over 18 months, we tried 4 different experimental protocols. Each time standard treatments failed, we found alternatives that offered hope. Each time insurance denied coverage, I found ways to pay for treatments that kept you alive when conventional medicine said there was nothing more they could do. Marcus studied the timeline, his expression growing more troubled as he absorbed the financial details alongside the medical information. The experimental treatments that had saved his life had cost more than many people earned in 3 years, and the entire burden had fallen on my shoulders. I had no idea it was this much, he said finally. When you told me about liquidating retirement savings, I thought you meant maybe $20,000 or $30,000. This is life-changing money, Starlee. This affects everything about our future. It affects our future because it gave us a future. Without those treatments, there would be no financial planning to worry about, no retirement to save for, no life to rebuild. The money bought us possibilities that would not have existed otherwise. Marcus set down the timeline and looked directly at me for the first time since I had returned from the conference room. But how do we recover from this? How do we rebuild our savings and plan for retirement when we are starting with negative net worth in our 30s? His question revealed the influence of his family's thinking. Instead of viewing the medical expenses as an investment in survival that had paid off spectacularly, he was seeing them as financial damage that needed to be repaired. The shift in perspective was subtle but significant. We rebuild the same way any couple recovers from major medical expenses. We work, we save, we make smart financial decisions, and we appreciate that we have the opportunity to rebuild because you survived. The alternative was not financial security with a deceased husband. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sterling and Jenica, who entered Marcus's room with expressions that mixed concern for his health with displeasure about my refusal to sign the divorce papers. Their timing suggested they had been waiting outside the door for an opportunity to rejoin the discussion. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Jenica directed her attention exclusively to Marcus while pointedly ignoring my presence. "We heard you were having a serious conversation, and we did not want you to become overtired." Sterling approached Marcus's bed with the casual authority he had always exercised in family situations. "We should probably discuss next steps now that everyone has had time to consider the legal options. The divorce papers provide protection for everyone involved and create a foundation for financial recovery." Marcus looked between his parents and me, clearly uncomfortable with being forced to choose sides while still recovering from surgery. The situation had been carefully orchestrated to maximize family pressure while minimizing his ability to resist their preferred outcome. "I want to understand something," Marcus said slowly. "The divorce papers make Starlee solely responsible for all medical debt, even though the treatments were for my cancer. How is that fair or legal?" His question surprised everyone, including me. Despite 18 months of family pressure and manipulation, some part of him recognized the injustice of assigning complete financial liability to the person who saved his life. Sterling launched into an explanation of legal liability and financial protection that was designed to sound authoritative while obscuring the fundamental unfairness of their proposal. But she made those decisions because I was too sick to make them myself. And she made them to save my life when you all were still hoping that positive thinking and family love would cure stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The room fell silent. For the first time since his diagnosis, Marcus had directly challenged his family's narrative about his illness and recovery. The sanitized version they preferred, where expensive medical intervention was unnecessary and natural healing was primary, had been contradicted by the patient himself. Jenica tried to salvage the situation with emotional manipulation. "We all want what's best for you, darling. The stress of financial problems and legal battles will not help your recovery. Sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the greater good." "The greater good," Marcus repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Whose greater good? Divorcing my wife protects your assets while leaving her responsible for saving my life. How does that serve anyone except you?" The conversation that followed would determine not just the fate of our marriage, but the future of Marcus's relationship with his family and his understanding of what love, loyalty, and sacrifice really meant when tested by crisis. What happened next surprised everyone in that hospital room, including me. Marcus pulled himself up straighter in his bed and addressed his parents with the clarity and strength I had not heard from him in months. "I want you both to leave," he said quietly but firmly. "I need time along with my wife to discuss our marriage and our future without family pressure or legal manipulation." Jenica started to protest. "Sweetheart, you are not thinking clearly. The medication and stress have affected your judgment. We're just trying to protect everyone involved." "My judgment is fine," Marcus replied. "Fine enough to recognize that you're asking my wife to accept complete financial responsibility for medical expenses that saved my life while giving up all authority over my future medical care. That is not protection. That is punishment for her dedication." Sterling made one final attempt to maintain control of the situation. "Son, you are not seeing the bigger picture. The medical debt affects family resources and planning. We need to find practical solutions that work for everyone." Marcus turned to look at me, and for the first time in months, I saw the man I had married instead of the patient who had been manipulated by family pressure and medical trauma. "The practical solution is acknowledging that my wife saved my life and deserves gratitude rather than exile." He asked his parents to leave again, and this time they complied, though their expressions promised that this conversation was far from over. When the door closed behind them, Marcus and I were alone together for the first time since his readmission to the hospital. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Actually, I owe you several apologies, but I want to start with the biggest one. I allowed my family to make you feel like saving my life was somehow wrong or excessive. That was inexcusable." The relief I felt at hearing those words was overwhelming. For 18 months, I had carried the weight of financial sacrifice without acknowledgement or appreciation. His recognition of my dedication felt like oxygen after nearly suffocating on family criticism and manipulation. "I remember more than I let them think I do. I remember the night you told me about the experimental treatment in Philadelphia and how you promised we would find a way to pay for it. I remember you researching clinical trials while I was too sick to focus on anything except surviving each day. I remember you fighting with insurance companies and coordinating care across multiple hospitals." He reached for my hand, his grip still weak but determined. "What I did not fully understand until now was that you were doing all of that alone, while my family questioned your judgment and criticized your decisions. You saved my life and then had to defend those choices to people who should have been thanking you." The conversation that followed was honest in ways our marriage had never been before. Marcus acknowledged how his family's wealth and social position had created expectations and pressures that had affected our relationship from the beginning. I admitted how isolated and unsupported I had felt during his illness, fighting for his survival while managing family criticism and manipulation. The most important thing was that we talked about what we wanted our marriage to look like going forward. The medical crisis had revealed fundamental differences in values and priorities that needed to be addressed before we could rebuild our relationship on solid ground. "I cannot go back to the old dynamic with my family," Marcus said. "Their response to your sacrifice has shown me something about their character that I cannot ignore. Love should not be conditional on financial convenience or social acceptability." Over the following weeks, as Marcus's recovery continued, we made decisions that would reshape our life together. We moved to a smaller apartment that we could afford on my income alone, reducing our monthly expenses while eliminating the pressure to maintain Hamilton family standards. Marcus found work at a nonprofit organization focused on cancer patient advocacy, using his experience to help other families navigate the complex world of experimental treatments and medical financing. The salary was modest compared to his previous corporate position, but the work gave him purpose beyond family expectations. We established clear boundaries with his parents that prioritized our marriage over their comfort. Family gatherings became optional rather than obligatory, and financial discussions were declared off limits unless we specifically requested their input. The most significant change was in how we approached the medical debt I had accumulated during Marcus's illness. Instead of viewing it as a burden to be eliminated through legal maneuvering or family assistance, we treated it as an investment in our future that would be repaid through shared effort and careful financial planning. The experimental treatments that had cost $150,000 had given Marcus decades of potential life that otherwise would have been lost. Spread across those years, the cost seemed reasonable rather than excessive, an investment in possibilities rather than a financial mistake. 6 months after Marcus's discharge from the hospital, we received news that validated every financial decision I had made during his illness. His oncologist reported that he remained in complete remission with no signs of cancer recurrence. The experimental treatments had not just extended his life, they had cured him entirely. The Hamilton family response to this medical triumph was complicated by their previous criticism of the treatments that had achieved it. They could not celebrate Marcus's cure without acknowledging that the expensive interventions they had questioned were medically necessary and completely successful. Our relationship with them gradually improved as time passed and emotions cooled, but it was built on new terms that recognized my role in Marcus's survival rather than minimizing it. The divorce papers were never mentioned again, filed away as evidence of a crisis that had revealed everyone's true priorities. The most unexpected outcome of our ordeal was how it strengthened our marriage rather than destroying it. Facing death together created bonds that could not be broken by family pressure or financial stress. We had learned that love expressed through sacrifice was more valuable than love expressed through comfortable agreement. Marcus often tells people that he survived cancer twice, once through medical treatment and once by recognizing that his wife's dedication deserved gratitude rather than criticism. The second survival was harder, but more important for our future happiness. As I finish sharing this story, we are approaching the 3rd anniversary of Marcus's final cancer treatment. Our financial recovery continues steadily, our marriage is stronger than it has ever been, and our appreciation for each day we have together remains profound. To anyone facing similar family dynamics or medical crises, I want you to know that love sometimes requires standing alone against criticism and manipulation. Saving someone's life is never excessive. Defending your spouse is never inappropriate. And sacrifice motivated by love is never something to apologize for. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to Revengenius for more authentic conversations about family dynamics, financial sacrifice, and the true meaning of loyalty. Share your own experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Remember that boundaries are not walls against love, but foundations for authentic relationships built on mutual respect and genuine appreciation. Take care of yourselves and each other.